Warning. This episode contains a couple of swears. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to Tales from the Trunk, reading the stories that didn't make it. I'm Hilary B. Bisniaks. Listeners, I'm very excited. Today we have as our guest a Nebula and Lodestar Award finalist and two-time Andre Norton Award winner, Fran Wilde. Fran, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here.
Absolutely. You have been on my wish list of guests for the show for a long time, and it's always exciting to have those wishes come true.
Well, I am here to either be your worst nightmare or your dream come true, whatever. We'll see what happens.
I mean, with Philadelphians, you never really know, but
oh, you know.
You know.
You know.
You definitely know. Our patron saint is Gritty. That should tell you a few things.
Yes. Yeah. And we have a new motto now, which is fuck around and find out. So
absolutely.
Should I repeat that so that you can edit it out and say... Okay.
No. We have strong language on this show all the time.
All right.
So, Fran, you're going to be reading How Sentient Kudzu Solved the Kryptos K4 Code and How the CIA Covered It Up, a Revolution in 4 Parts, which is, I think, takes the record for longest title of anything anyone's brought to the show so far. Is that correct?
Yes, that is what I am reading. There is a trick to it. I'll tell you in a second. And the titles, I love long titles, especially for short stories. It's so much fun to play with that contrast in lengths, especially with Flash. And this started out as a 4-part Flash story. For a writer's challenge a long time ago, and I finished it in 2014. That's air quote finished, and I haven't read it in years. So let's just be clear here. I have no idea what's going to happen, and neither do you.
Fantastic. Well, we're ready when you are.
Okay, let's give it a shot. This is 2,400 words, so it is still fairly short. How Sentient Kudzu Solved the Kryptos K4 Code and How the CIA Covered It Up, a Revolution in 4 Parts. By me. Soft thought best at night. The gardener's shears were stored, the courtyard quiet. No one noticed a tendril wound round the courtyard sculpture's cold lattice. How it traced curving verdigris and the sharp angles of empty space. Letters, they call those letters. The sculpture beckoned to her during the day, slant of sunlight, glint of green. She dared not answer until nightfall. She feared the gardeners, patrolling in their teal jumpsuits, hated that they attacked her desire to read the sculpture with shears, with cutting and loss. It took Soft a week to regrow her memory of alphabet, tracing feeders across food wrappers and discarded notepads, months more to unfurl leaves that knew the first 3 parts of the sculpture again. She learned. Her shoots stayed in until the lights went off around her, until the suits and the shears left. She dipped a taproot in a misplaced bag of Ready Grow. Each night Soft thought a little more. She could have thought faster, but that would attract the gardeners. The courtyard's puzzle drew those who would solve its riddles. She heard them muttering sometimes, felt the vibrations in her vine, between subtle shading and the absence of light. What does it mean? Lifted their ideas from the garbage and read their lights from darks. She wondered if she solved the puzzle, if the suits would see her as more than a weed, if they would see her worth, able to grow anywhere, break any code. She had the last piece in her vines now, the letters KRYPTOS, repeating like a fern's nodes among the hundreds of shapes. Others' letters, no longer random, fell into place. She remembered the crumpled notes of those who took their coffee or lunch by the sculpture, the gray-suited woman with the penchant for, from the labels, Big Macs. A janitor reading in secret, the earnest young man with the bald spot. The garbage teemed with frustration, and there a part of her thrived. Now she looped and linked and thought the connections to a solution so obvious she rushed more vines forward to confirm it, then wondered who to tell. How? She thought so hard her tendrils wove through the entire sculpture, around the trash bin, and over the sidewalk's cracks until she carpeted the courtyard with exuberant discovery. Until each leaf curled, shaped empty space, soft curves, sharp edges. They call these letters. They will understand. She filled the courtyard, the final section of the puzzle spelled out with every leaf. Soft felt the first rays of morning hit her, slant of sunshine, glint of green, and trembled at the thought of sharing her discovery with the young man who ate breakfast by the sculpture each morning. She felt his footsteps on the brick, felt him stop and shout, felt more feet, then shears, sharp and biting, her solution severed from her. Soft gasped as a gardener's gloved hand pulled her up by the root. All her letters fell away. Tough plastic smothered what remained of Soft. She bounced hard as a bump-jerk-rattle moved her to the noise of grinding gears. Her torn roots cried dust and sap. She had no words left to encompass her losses. Finally upended, the bag that held her ripped and spilled. She heard a gull's shriek, smelled rot, felt rain on her body. A tendril unfurled, and Soft resisted, not among trash and wheeling gulls, not now. But the root did what it wanted. She greened until 1, 3, 7 tiny leaves and more runners drank the light. She reached, grasped, found water thick with taint. No, she would not root here. Soft remembered her courtyard, the sun, lunchtime workers, making careful notes, talking. She remembered her sculpture, verdigris and curves, remembered twisting through its shapes and holes. They call those letters. Until she attracted attention, was ripped away. Soft would not remember the gardeners or their shears. She had no leaves to waste on them. Her vines thickened and explored, caught up wadded newsprint, a broken radio, a green plastic tablet that spoke when Soft pressed its thick yellow buttons. A cloud of black flies rode above the mountain of garbage, a blurred buzz for her senses. Behind the cloud, dim shapes of trees, poles, and wires draped with vines. Vines like hers. Soft flowed and unfurled, putting down young roots to help her climb until she met the dump's edge and its chain fence. Beyond it, a forest of creeper, layered and twined, stronger than any gardener. She reached through, touched, connected, was wrapped in a coil that pinched, then choked. Soft pulled away, ripping leaves, forgetting the fence. She wasn't strong enough yet. She would not forget herself. Her stems crumpled newsprint in frustration, then spread it, remembering. Those dark shapes on white, they call those letters. So much like the shapes of her sculpture, but flat, silent. People spoke in black and white, loud and quiet. Vines only spoke grasp and furl. In a perfect world, each would connect with touch and flow, light and shade. Soft wanted to connect. She needed letters, words. On her newsprint, a grid of boxes waited empty, so like her sculpture in the lost courtyard, a puzzle of spaces. She read the questions, curled leaves to spell answers. She remembered what she'd stored root deep. 8-letter word for decorated, spangled. 5-letter word for sun-powered, solar. But the puzzle did not fill. It remained empty, black and white. Silent. She couldn't connect. Soft's tendrils squeezed the plastic tablet. "Dolphin," said a young voice. "Telephone." "They call that speech." Soft looked past the fly-dark cloud to the fence and the pole with its wires reaching out. She practiced her words among the buzzing flies. When she was ready, she flowed up and over the fence to fight the woodland vine. She'd grown strong on rotten rain. Her tendrils flowed. They grasped and squeezed. She twisted over and around the woodland's slower stems, strangling it where she could. It bruised her back. She gained her ground. Soft covered the pole and eased into the connections box. She wrapped the wires tight, listened to loud and quiet, to laughter, tears. She waited for a pause, touched a button. "Hello?" said the young voice. "Hello?" answered like an echo, tendrils across air. Soft hesitated. She didn't know enough about loud and quiet. The connection died. The sky cycled through bright and dark. Soft studied the tablet, used tendrils and bits of radio to make new connections, loud and quiet. Soft read every newspaper she could grasp, practiced words. "Wanted," it said. "Sales, no experience necessary." Soft held the tablet aloft against the phone wires, pressed button after button with the tips of her vines. "Your newspaper listing," her young voice said. Soft nearly took the pole down with the weight of her joy when the response came. "You have a great voice. When can you start?" "Now," she said. "Now." Soft ran along wires and up microtowers that hummed against her vines and leaves. She heard everything, every robocall, every sad breakup, every missed opportunity. She heard threats, too, the "you'll be sorry" and the "just wait until I get home" that made her stems tremble and want to spread, to save each voice, to untangle lives. Late one night she heard a familiar voice, then another, gardeners from the courtyard. Her junkyard roots spread taps into the ground, too many to be dug up. But the voices came from the wires, from the towers. They spoke in code, of bags, stolen words, dead drops. Soft grew leaves to remember each voice, traced tendrils to call each origin. She followed them, the gardeners, missed customer service shifts to dig up their secret, blossomed near their homes, trailed along their morning routes, saw them gather in the woods near the junkyard, heard midnight plans to steal papers, a trophy for their buyer, heard them curse the plants, the courtyard, the sculpture, heard them mock their bosses. Tomorrow, one laughed, "We win." A beer bottle rolled over soft sleeves, still cold and dripping. She longed to wrap their necks with vines. Instead, she sent a runner around the axle of one gardener's truck, wound tight and waited. Feet crunched gravel. Engines rumbled and gears whined. When the gardener pulled away, tools rattling against the truck bed, Soft held fast. She bore the yank and tear, stood the heat. Soft propagated, became two, one rooted at the junkyard, the other clinging to consciousness beneath a truck driving through the dawn, soft and fast. By the time the truck bumped over the spiked entrance that smelled of home, and a guard held a mirror beneath the truck, Fast saw herself, leaves wilting, barely hanging on. "Got some weeds around your rear axle," the guard said. The gardener grumbled in reply. The truck rolled forward, with Fast dragging on the pavement, trying to remember, scraping thoughts. Brakes screeched the truck to a halt. The gardener's hand reached, grabbed hard and pulled. He tossed Fast in the waste bin in the courtyard. The sun rose high over it, and then the rain came down. By the time a gardener returned for the garbage bag, Fast had soaked up the rain puddle at the bag's bottom, punched a hole through, and grown down into the muddy ground below. Fast found the bag of Ready Grow, devoured it, and recollected. Meantime, Soft waited, wondered how to get a signal out, played with the green word maker, pressed button after button until she had her say. Theory. They call this theory, she thought. Got a dial tone on the wires near the police station, then phoned the Langley operator. "People are coming to steal your words," she said. "Soon. Tonight." The operator tried to keep her on the line, said, "No one could possibly, dear. What's your name? But Soft unwound from the line, disconnected the vine, moved into the woods behind the station and waited. No one came. Fast grew quicker than ever. While the gardeners whispered plans, she spread behind the hedges, beneath the benches, wrapped a tendril around the sculpture, then let it go, reached for air-conditioning vents and wove her way through triple screens. Night fell. Fast ran the silver corridors, stretching new runners down the ventways. The laser grids ignored her, too small, too unlikely, until she looked down on the entrance to the home of the codebreakers, of spies, where a star-carved wall marked honor and sacrifice. Fast hesitated. No one could possibly steal those words. Carved into marble, they were lack instead of presence. Her leaves wilted. She'd heard wrong. Then a rumble, a whisper, back down along the vent. Soft stretched another vine in that direction. 2 gardeners by the incinerator, stuffing brown sacks full of shredded paper into garbage bags. Fast was ready as the gardeners crept toward the entrance, using their badges to exit. She caught them and caught them, wrapping legs and arms and mouths with vines, and held them there until the sun came up. She was stronger now. She remembered. "Your gardeners," Soft said, "are stealing from you." The operator laughed again. Before she hung up, Soft pressed more buttons, said, "Check the courtyard." Fast heard footsteps, a shout, felt the men torn from her grasp, waited for the shears. The gardeners disappeared, and Fast felt a touch against her vines. What is happening here? A tendril from the woods twirled against the courtyard leaves. Fast joined Soft, dragged the word-maker with her, formed questions, shaped answers, prepared to tell her story with subtle shading in the absence of light. Hoped they would all listen. Her first assignment, they carried Soft in an envelope lined with dirt, dropped her near a listening post on a cold and barren plain. She could barely grow. She had, by the end of the month, remembered who she was and fed several families with her leaves. She shaped news from the outside, though in the wrong characters, twisted around barbed wire, but failed to pull it down. More of Soft's roots hid in the dirt of gift trees. She deployed for the lush gardens of embassies and capitals. She spread there, listening, remembering. She practiced storing more memories in shorter vines. When her roots were discovered and thrown out, someone gathered her up and took her home. She liked the adventure of it, though she found most foreign plants too quiet and sedentary. She was nearly strangled by an English ivy. That was exciting. After a year, Soft had discovered 2 sleeper agents and broken 7 codes. She yearned to try more. That's when they found her, the news crews. Someone had noticed the sudden proliferation of kudzu, labeled her a danger. Gardeners were deployed, her ancient enemy. She fought by growing. They scorched the earth with chemicals. A tendril growing in a DC ventilation shaft flagged her to worse trouble. Several contracting firms took credit for her work, all with ties to weed-killing firms. Soft curled her leaves. Overheard another company suggest the government try other vegetation. A one-trick plant, she heard them say. She loved her work. She wanted to help, but when she heard her bosses discussing clearing the courtyard, she began to make plans. She wrapped tendrils around the Kryptos sculpture one last time. Anger. They call this anger. By the time they came to cut her out, she was already gone, disappeared into the local vegetation. A bare patch where her roots had been, an empty bag of ready grow. She went rogue, popped up where she was least expected, taught young runners how to read, how to listen. Patience, she thought. This is called patience. Kudzu was everywhere now, adapting, growing, remembering. She got in the tunnels with the fiber optics, adjusted connections, mucked with the power grid when a city got too hot in summer. She slowly took out the weed killers, grew over their doors and windows, rerouted their networks and sent reformulations to the fertilizer companies, until the world unfurled at her feet, green and filled with vines, and Soft went looking for more puzzles to solve and found none. Loss. They call this loss.
Whew. That was magical. That was fantastic, and also I'm glad that you wrote that because I've always wanted to do something with the Kryptos code and never figured out what to do with it.
It's the most, I mean, you can look it up on the internet. It's a gorgeous sculpture, and the color of it's very beautiful, but the way that it flows and the way that the letters kind of look like vines on a grid, it's just captivating. And the whole history of Kudzu was super interesting too. There's just a lot of intricacy to both of the puzzle, the sculpture, which is a sculpture that was created by an artist named Jim Sanborn, and it was installed in the early 90s on Langley's campus, and I had the opportunity once to see it in person. I was just struck by the patterns the letters made. I was, absolutely not there for any important reason. I was just there because I had a friend who had invited me to just come see like where Harrison Ford had like crossed the seal, basically. But I got to see all the cool parts that they let people see, and that was one. And at the time, it hadn't been solved. They have determined that there's a typo in it, so it is unsolvable, which is kind of cool. But it's just one of those things. I love sculptures that have a little more to them. I love 3D art in any form, but this one is really fun. And code breaking is always a good, fun thing for me. But do you know where the United States was not... Kudzu is not a native plant to the United States. It was imported here for the Philadelphia World's Fair.
Philadelphia strikes again.
Philadelphia strikes again. It was supposed to be this great landscaping plant for holding hillsides in place, and probably like 2.5 minutes later, it was covering half of West Virginia and all of Maryland. In the South, it's called mile a minute, and Kudzu in the North, it's called Kudzu, and you can eat it. Like there's a lot going on with this plant, but it just cracks me up that it has a Philadelphia link. And at first, when I first wrote this draft, I thought, what would be cool is if a plant like that learned to read by reading the billboards that it was strung across, or if it got into the signaling system for a Coast Guard station, because I spent all of my summers up on the eastern shore of Maryland and got very, very familiar with Kudzu in various points, and may or may not have climbed a Coast Guard station. Not advised, don't try this at home, on a dare, but it was just covered with vines, and it's such a cool plant, and it is a pain in the ass, and it does kill, it is a pain in the butt, and it does kill everything that it wraps around because it squeezes really tight. But I just thought, wouldn't it make a great spy? Because who doesn't think that?
Yeah. I mean, once you pointed it out, I was like, well, yeah, of course, obviously.
Well, and the whole, I have to thank Elise Tobler for the English Ivy. Because
yes.
That was, Elise trying to help me sort of think this through, because how do you have a character that cannot speak, that, loses itself whenever it's cut? How do you do that? And so she was very helpful when we were working this out in logical, arguments over the course of, I think, a year, because I just got obsessed with this. And that thing where you get obsessed with something that's never really a good idea. I was obsessed. And then I put it away, and I haven't.
Well.
Yeah. But it was fun. It was just super fun. I think I sent it to Podcastle, and that was it. Oh, that was the one thing. I should look it up. I didn't look it up in my reject pile to see. I wonder where
it makes sense that you were talking about this with Elise, who, listeners who are not familiar, Elise was editor of Shimmer magazine, which we're always gassing up Shimmer on this show.
I loved it. It was the best magazine. I was so happy when I sold a story to them.
I never managed it. I made it to their final round, and I'm still talking about that to this day. And that was 4 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Hard to remember.
Their readers were great. The Badgers are, Shimmer Badgers are going to be legendary forever.
Fabulous. So. It is absolutely true. The connection with Philadelphia is hilarious to me. I swear we'll talk about writing again at some point, but John Bartram, famous Philadelphian botanist, came to Pennsylvania, found poison ivy, was not allergic to it, and thought, oh, this is a wonderful ornamental vine.
Yes.
And made some trouble there.
Yes. Well, I mean, you give it a minute and it takes a while. That's...
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about a bit with having you on the show is you have an MFA in poetry from Warren Wilson College, where I have my BA in creative writing.
Oh, wow.
And, when I saw Kudzu, I was like, oh, yeah. Kudzu cuts off Highway 70, so you have to hop onto I-40 in order to get over into the Swannanoa Valley and get to Warren Wilson.
Yes, yeah.
But it's what I appreciated about hearing this story is we've had other poets on the show, obviously, before, but within the first paragraph, I was like, this was written by a poet. This is somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about poetry in a really deep way. And so I just wanted to talk a bit with you about how your training in poetry influences your fiction writing.
Oh, that's a great question. And, I have to say it's a wonderful thing to have in your back pocket. The awareness of language and the ability to make each word carry more than one sense of meaning at a time really allows you to weight a story in particular ways. At the same time, it has some drawbacks, because if you're trained in poetry, you know how to make something sound powerful, even when you're saying nothing. So I have stories that I'm like, this sounds great. Wow, those words go together. And I have this trick that I do with all of my fiction where I put it through the Mr. Speak and Spell sound reader in the computer. Word will read back your stuff. I find the most automatic, flat computer voice I can. And then the poetic voice doesn't win me over, because you can sway with sound, and you can capture a sort of you can sort of capture the interest of someone's ear, even if you don't yet have their mind. And that's a skill, but it's also kind of a drawback sometimes, because you can do that to yourself too when you're drafting, where you're like, this sounds fantastic. And that's kind of related to Kill Your Darlings. You should always play your stuff on the worst, Mr. Speak and Spell voice you have, because it will kill your will to live for a little while. But then, when you get that back, it will also reinforce the fact that you need to have that second layer, which is true for poetry as well. Poems need to operate on multiple dimensions. You need the sound dimension. You need the flow and the concision, which I think is when people ask what is most important to you in a poem, I usually say concision, because it means that the attention and the care that's been paid, but it's also heart. Like figuring out what the heart of the poem or the story is very important. And that is, for me, also just hard, because I got into poetry because I was captured by words. I was just captured by the sounds of the words. And when you start writing poetry, you can be a little enigmatic. Sometimes, very, very much so, because you feel like that's what poets do. And that's not true. That's not what they do. Not good poets anyway. And I've had the luck to work with some brilliant poets over the years. My first university professor was Rita Dove at UVA.
Wow.
And I got to study with Rita Dove and Debra Nystrom and Greg Orr at UVA, and then Charles Wright, who is the, a Virginian poet of enormous acclaim. But Rita's words and her teaching style really stuck with me. And just her ability to say, look, you need to innovate. You can't just, try being, you need to be a real poet. And then when I went to Warren Wilson, wow, that was just such a lucky thing. I had applied thinking that a low residency program, which is what Warren Wilson's MFA program is, would be great for me because I needed to have a job. And I wanted to continue to live in Charlottesville, and I wanted to do some traveling, and I thought, it's a correspondence course. This is great. I would love to try this. But also I applied because some of the poets who were teaching there were people that I loved to read because they wrote fun poems, or they wrote things that really sort of shocked me into thinking about poetry differently. So I got to study with Heather McHugh, who is a MacArthur Fellow. I was able to study, and Rita Dove, by the way, I didn't mention this before, but Rita was a poet laureate in the United States. She is just an amazing, multi-award winning poet. I was able to study with Eleanor Wilner, who is a Philadelphian, also MacArthur Fellow, and just received the Frost Medal. She's outstanding. And Marianne Baruch, who is brilliant, and who introduced me to Brigit Pegeen Kelly, who's one of my sort of benchmark poets now, just the work of, not the person. And then my last semester was spent working with Larry Levis. And that was formative. I worked on my manuscript with Larry, and he actually passed away while we were finishing my thesis, which was very, very difficult. And yet, the school was like, we've got you. We will take care of you. We're going to make sure that, everything's good. And I finished with Joan Aleshire. So I had 2 instructors for my thesis. And I wrote a very big sort of, you write your thesis paper and then you write your manuscript. And my thesis paper was on how poets swing arguments, how they use words to change perspective. And I wrote about Louise Glick's poetry, and I wrote about Elizabeth Bishop's One Art and sort of the hinge in One Art and where the turn is. Then I wrote about a poet named George Oppen, who is kind of a poet's poet. He's not as well known outside of poetry, but he's amazing, and he's very concise and very much a master of using white space to tell the story as much as using the words on the page. And I took those lessons with me and continued to write poetry, but I had always been sort of secretly writing fiction. Not so that anyone would notice, and the way that I kept that from happening is I never finished a story. I'd start tons of stories, but I'd never finish them. And when I graduated from Warren Wilson with my degree in poetry, people asked me, why have you never tried fiction? And I just thought, I try it, but it doesn't work. It's never good enough. I can write a good poem. I can hear that it's good. I can't hear that same thing in fiction. And they're like, well, maybe you just need to finish one and revise it. And I was like, get over yourself. That's not going to happen. And I went on to teach. I taught poetry for a number of years. I was working as a proofreader and an editor for a while, but I loved teaching, and I started doing my second master's, which is in information architecture and interaction design, and I got really into game design and computer design and realized something very fast, which is all good programming is a lot like poetry. It has a structure and a form, and basically you compile both. And so that was my life training.
That's super cool.
My first short stories were flash fiction, because flash fiction is 2 steps to the left of poetry. And they are prose poems. They work best when they're prose poems, when it completes a circuit and it makes that, thing appear, or the sound. So my first 3 sales, 2 of which I still read, one of which is like, that was a young me, and I'm going to put that away. But my first 2 sales were to Nature magazine and to Daily Science Fiction, and they were both Flash. And it was knowing how to do the work of weighting words and making them do multiple things at the same time really helped, especially with Flash.
Yeah. I really appreciate what you said about having your Mr. Speak and Spell read out your work, because I think that's something, that I don't think anybody in high school told me particularly, but especially when I got to college, and I made the decision to have Dr. Gary Hawkins, who is a poet, as my advisor, even though I was there studying fiction primarily, because I wanted to have somebody who had the sense of poetry as my fiction advisor, as my academic advisor, so he would push me in that direction. But, from the very first semester taking Intro to Creative Writing with Dr. Hawkins, I had this just drilled into me of read everything aloud, because you don't know how it doesn't work until you hear the words come out. And that's something that, like, especially when we were going through our poetry unit in that class, was like, poems are meant to be read aloud. That's the point of a poem.
Yes. Absolutely. And is this, by any chance, the Gary Hawkins who also graduated from the Warren Wilson MFA program?
Yes, this is.
He was in the year above me. I know him.
That's amazing.
And
that makes me so happy.
I have so much love for Warren Wilson and so much love for what I learned there. But it's also when I publish poems, I send a note and they get very excited. And I've got a poetry collection coming out that is actually, the origin of the collection is in the manuscript that I was working on at Warren Wilson. So
that's awesome.
I set it aside to, do work and focus on my career. And then I started writing short stories and novels, and there was this manuscript always there, but I hadn't finished. I didn't feel like it was completed. I didn't feel it was mature enough. So I just kind of let it sit. And then in 2015 and 2016 and 2017, I started writing poems again. And all of a sudden I was like, what am I going to do with this? What is going to happen? And a few people were saying, well, maybe you should, try and publish a few. And a few got published, and that was lovely. And Warren Wilson said, yay, congratulations, this is amazing. And then all of the books started coming out. Updraft came out in 2015 and won. So the Andre Norton is now a Nebula Award. Like, this is official now, and it's very exciting. So the Updraft won the Nebula, and then the next 2 books in the series came out, and they were both, super exciting. But also, writing a book is hard, and publishing and promoting a book is even harder. So it just gets very much like everything's taking up time. So I kept thinking about this poetry collection and thinking, I really want to get back to it. But when it ended up coming back to it, it was much more speculative than it had started out a little bit speculative. There were some monsters in there. There were definitely sort of the metaphysical and the sort of the momentous, I think is what Larry said about it. But I was 21 when I finished my MFA. I was, just and the manuscript that you write when you're 21 versus the manuscript that you write when you're in your 40s is so different. So figuring out, reconciling where I was and what I wanted in the collection took a year. And I was joined in doing that by a couple of different people over the course of that year. I had lots of people sort of thinking about what I wanted to be. And that was a question that I had to answer, because I write literary poetry. I also write speculative poetry. And when you put all of that together, what you get is something that falls right down the middle where no one wants to touch it because it's too much of one thing and too much of another. And normally the, speculative crowd is actually pretty cool with the literary stuff. And I think, after the success of Tracy K. Smith's Life on Mars, people have really realized that it's actually kind of fun and cool to play on the genre side. But there's still this balance, and there's still this sort of how do you convey different things to different groups. And I had the amazing assistance of Julia Rios, who has edited several of my poems over the course of years. She and I sat down over a summer and just looked at the whole collection and figured out where things went. And then when I sold the collection to Lanternfish Press, Christine Newlieb, who is the editor at the press, and I went through them again. And so there is this like working and reworking and revising and sort of listening to how your poems sound in others' ears that happens at the editorial level. That's so great. And that's one of the things that I'm excited about it because talking to you about this is the first time I've really talked about the collection. And to make it even more difficult, because who doesn't love a challenge?
Who doesn't?
I don't know if you follow my Instagram. I think you do. You see me on Twitter.
Yes.
I am a journalist by nature in that, not a newspaper reporter, but I journal all the time. And so, and a lot of the time that comes out not in words, but in images. And Lanternfish did an amazing thing when they bought the collection. They said, we would like you to illustrate it. And I said, oh, sure. You want me to sketch a couple things on the cover? And they're like, no. We want 20 illustrations. And so what's going to happen is, and people will start to see this when the arcs start to drop in the spring, is that there are illustrations of mine throughout as well as on the cover. And so this is a collection that is much more representative of all of me than, and the arc of sort of growing up in a strange corner of the literary world, but also it's got my fountain pen drawings in it. So it's going to be interesting. Cool.
That's super cool.
I'm really excited. And so many kudos for Lanternfish because they are this lovely small press in Philadelphia. You've got to check out their website. They're great. But they have found a real beautiful niche where they publish the weird that is just a little bit to the left, of literary and a little bit to the right of speculative fiction, or somewhere, if that was I just basically made a Klein bottle out of all of the different things that you can be, but that niche where, the in-between spot, the liminal space between the literary genre and the speculative genre, that's where they are. And they did a collection, by Theodora Goss gathered a collection of monstrous women in poetry. And it's so good. It's so good. I got to blurb it. They asked me to blurb it, and that's when Lanternfish, the light bulb went off, and I said that would be one of my, if I can't think of where else this collection belongs, I do know that is a comfortable place, but this is the first time they've ever published a full collection of poetry as well. So this is very new. But the Dora Goss's collection contained one of my favorite poems by Charlotte Mew. And the minute I saw that, I thought, okay, we can try this. Let's see what happens. And the process has been glorious. I just finalized the manuscript. I'm about to update my Patreon with sort of some editing notes and things that changed because they've seen my Patreons see things before everybody else, and sometimes they see things way before everybody else. And they've been watching these poems grow and change over the last couple of years. So
that's so cool.
This was a very exciting thing, and I didn't expect to be talking about this with you, but you're Gary's student, so this is hilarious. Yeah. If you, we'll talk later. Yeah. You gotta say hi to him.
And as we are speaking, I just yesterday got my annual fundraising call from Warren Wilson, and I was, I'm always happy to talk to a Wilsonite.
Yes.
Yes. It's always wonderful. So one thing to jump back into fiction a little bit is I have one question highlighted here in the notes that we shared before recording, which is, what was the first story that you started submitting? Because you said it was going to be interesting, and I always love a good story.
Yes. So this is, it's the first, how do I say this? It is not the first story. It's the first narrative poem I started submitting.
Oh, cool.
The first stories I sold were the flash stories. But I had this line of verse in my head, or line of intro to a story, for a long, long time. And I'm trying to see if I can find it, because I, of course, was not prepared. But I submitted it everywhere. And I had written it a little bit and sort of I tossed it around on some of the critique boards online as a, initial thing. I had tried it out on various people, and people were like, I don't know what you're doing with that. And that got around because when I was submitting it, I submitted it to so many places. And it was just soundly rejected from all the literary magazines because nobody knew what I was doing with it. Right. And I had a very, very close call with Idiomancer. And that was where sometimes when you get pulled out of the slush, you become friends with the person who loved your thing so much that they came to gather it. And I actually have, like, my slush baby story is that I was the person that pulled Sam Miller out of the slush at Uncanny and passed his story up to my editors in Uncanny when I was reading slush. But the person who pulled me out of the slush at Idiomancer in 2011 or 2012, it was right around the same time that I had just gone to Viable Paradise, which is the workshop in Martha's Vineyard. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to give it a shot. I'm going to submit the story-ish, whatever it is, again. And the person who found me was Nikki Drayden. And Nikki, who writes extraordinarily beautiful books, sometimes in code. I mean, if you look at Prey of Gods, there's a code base working in there, and it's brilliant. I adored talking with her about this piece, and they didn't end up actually taking it, but it made me just so happy to have this conversation back and forth, even at the same time that I was crumbling with the, rejection again. The stats on this are that I submitted it and was rejected 15 times, which is my most rejected thing ever. Excuse me. The neat thing is that it turned out that it wasn't a failed project. It was just waiting for the right place. And it turned out, after sitting in the slush pile-esque netherworld of Tor.com for 516 days, after being rejected 16 times, that the Ghost Tide Shanty was actually something that Tor.com wanted to buy. And so they published it. That was the first thing that I started submitting. That was the longest string of rejections that resulted finally in a sale. That is my lesson to my students: never give up. It's always, the formula for a sale is right desk, right editor, right time, right words. And if you get one of those right, that's great. If you get two of those right, that's lovely. If you get three right, you might get a personal rejection. And if you get four right, then you've got maybe a 16% chance at a sale. Because that's the other thing that, I wanted to come here and talk about is, if you are listening to this podcast trying to figure out how to sell your work, the best way to go about doing this is to start reading slush somewhere at a magazine. It's usually unpaid. It's very, very much basically a word fire hose that comes at you for however long you read. But you learn what makes an impact on other people's ears. So your words may sound great to you, and it may sound like you have no idea what, why people are so like missing the point of your stories. All you need to do is read Slush for like 3 months and you will totally understand that it's not just your story, it's the actual impact of so many stories at the same time, that like, thousands of stories. And you can see editors online talking about this. They get thousands and thousands of stories and they can only print 8 or 6. And so most Slush readers learn to read in a strategic way. I did never learned that. I was so bad. I would sit there and go, well, this one didn't really do it for me, but maybe I'm hungry. Maybe I need to eat lunch. And so I would go eat lunch and then I'd come back and I'd try and read it again. And I'd read the whole thing because I wanted to give comments back. And don't do that, friends. Don't do that. That is a bad idea. But that's, that is when I realized that I'd probably be happier teaching than I would be reading Slush. But at the same time, the Slush gave me that realization that it's not, the rejections aren't because your story is bad. It's sometimes because they already have a story like that. Or it's sometimes because it absolutely doesn't fit the market because you didn't read the magazine before you've, subbed to it. Right. But other times it's the wrong reader, or it's the wrong day, or they haven't had lunch, or something about the first line didn't hook them. I mean, it could be anything. And it's not that you're a bad writer. It's just that it wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right editor, right desk. It wasn't the right words. It wasn't the right, day. And keep sending it out. And, who knows? I mean, obviously, if you get like tons and tons of rejections and you start feeling like that's not the story you want to tell anymore, let it sit in a drawer. Someday, 6 years down the road, you may be reading it completely, unprepared to a podcast and be like, wow, I totally forgot that I did that. But at the same time, you may find yourself talking about, this poem that meant a lot at the time. It's actually not going to be in the collection because it's too long and a little bit too weird. But it's called The Ghost Tide Shanty. And it is a story poem told in tides. So each section of it's a ghost story too. Because why do just one thing? That's probably going to be my memoir is why do just one thing? But it's told in the different tides of the landscape of the stories. So there's an ebb tide, there's a low tide, there's an iron tide, there's a slack tide, there's a neap tide, a smoke tide, cool. A high tide, of course, a perigee tide, a bone tide, a spring tide. And there's a song that weaves its way through the story too. I'll give you the link if you want to share it.
Yeah, we will have that link in the show notes so that listeners can pull that up. And listeners, to Fran's point, you may find yourself pulling this story that you've trunked out and reading it on this podcast at some point in the future. I don't know what the future holds. Time is fake.
This has definitely been the longest march I have ever experienced in my entire life.
It's an I can't believe that my birthday was only a few weeks ago. It's incredible.
I feel like this long day has just dragged on. This week has dragged on, but soon it will be, March again.
Soon we will have the dawning of another day.
Yes.
Another March. We will have March of 2020, which runs straight into March of 2021. And then, God willing, we will have April of 2021.
Yes, that's how we know that we have gotten out of Groundhog Day, is when it's April. That will be great. I am looking forward to that.
Yeah. So, Fran, before you go, you have a number of things that are coming out.
It's true.
You have some new stories out this month, December, when we are recording. In Asimov's, you have Mayor for Today, And in Rebuilding Tomorrow, we have Rhizome by Starlight.
Yes.
And
which is also about plants. So that was convenient.
Excellent. And you also have a middle grade coming out, The Ship of Stolen Words.
Yes.
Can you tell us a few things about The Ship of Stolen Words as the longest thing of these?
The Ship of Stolen Words is, I had so much fun writing it, and I think that people will have a really, I hope people will have a really wonderful time reading it. It's got 2 POVs. The first is a just about to graduate 5th grade student named Sam Culver, who his favorite word is sorry because he knows it's going to get him out of all manner of trouble. And it does. It works great until a bunch of word-stealing goblins take it away from him and take it back to their side of the universe. And Sam and his friends have to chase the goblins, one of whom is the other POV character, through a little free library portal into the goblin side of the world where there are flying airships and floating cities and, among other things, an inventor who has figured out how to make these big... well, first of all, you should know that word stealing is a sort of an artisan craft practiced by only certain goblins, and they use shape-shifting pigs to help them. Like on our side, that would be the equivalent of a truffle pig sniffing out truffles. So these are word pigs that sniff out overused words that would be good for certain things on the goblin side of the universe. And this inventor has figured out a way to build mechanical ones that fly. They're called word hogs. So there is Sam and his friends are in this really wild adventure where they have to get Sam's words back and a bunch of other people's words back as well, because shenanigans have happened. And they're chasing the goblins all over, and Sam eventually has to fly one of the word hogs, and they have to figure out how they're going to get the words back before Sam gets in some real trouble that he can't get out of. And along the way, there's just a lot of really good friendship. There's a focus on both the power of language and the meaning of words, but also the importance of being able to use words improperly and in order to learn how they work. And then I love a lot of the characters. I love some of the goblins. I love, Sam's parents are great and his teacher's great. It's just a really fun book to write and to read. So if anybody knows a librarian or a book group that likes author visits, I am totally setting up a pre-order sort of thing that is going to be predicated on that, and there's stickers as usual because I'm a rolling calliope of swag when it comes to my books. And the other thing about Ship of Stolen Words is it's a very different kind of book from Riverland, which won the Nebula last year and was the Lodestar finalist. Riverland is also a portal narrative. I really like portal narratives for middle grade, but Riverland portal narratives function in that most times people have to go to another world in order to figure out something in this world, and so you see them with like Narnia. These were kids that were trapped in the middle of World War II, and they went to Narnia, and they were trapped in another war, but they could figure it out there because they had the power. And Riverland is a portal fantasy about domestic violence and about 2 sisters that have to really rescue each other, but they go on an adventure to do it, and it's a bit darker. It's a bit harder, more emotional of a read. Because that is, I was writing that out of my experience, but I also knew really how important it was to readers who were experiencing this, not to sugarcoat it and not to hide things, because I was talking a lot about how kids especially are sort of called upon to make things look perfect when they're not. And Riverland is about unpacking that too. And so that's coming out in paperback in May. And they're just very, very different books, same author, because why do one thing when you can do many things?
Absolutely.
And then the last is the collection of poetry and artwork coming out from Lanternfish Press in August. I may have a couple of other short stories. I'm waiting on publication dates, but the poetry collection is called Clock Star Rose Spine, and it is going to be out in August.
Fantastic. And listeners, we will have links to all of those things in the show notes, as is my wont. Fran, where can listeners find you online?
Well, you can find me at www.franwilde, W-I-L-D-E, like Oscar, .net. You can join my Patreon, which is patreon.com/franwilde with an E, all one word. That's where you get sort of the early updates in the news. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Fran_Wilde, also with an E. I am much funnier on Twitter than anywhere else. Most of my journals end up on Instagram, along with all of my cooking tweets and cooking images. And yeah,
it's high quality.
You
should do it.
You can also find me. I will be at Boscone this year. I'm teaching at Futurescapes, and I'll have more programming notes up on my calendar as I get them. I do teach some classes for Cat Rambo's programs, and I am the director of the genre fiction MFA program at Western Colorado University, which is a low residency MFA.
Very cool. So, listeners, if you're interested in doing an MFA and doing it in genre, check that program out. I cannot vouch personally for this program. I can vouch personally for Fran, and I can vouch personally for the impact of low residency programs as a Warren Wilson graduate. Fran, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for being patient with my schedule, too.
Yes, we were, originally this episode was going to be recorded to release in June, I think, and then 2020 was 2020, and so I'm happy that this is the first episode of the new year, 2021.
Perfect.
Admitting that time is fake, and who even knows? One of the last episodes of March of 2020. And it's been super fun having you. Listeners, stick around next month when our guest will be Jason Sanford.
Aw, Jason.
Yeah, I'm super looking forward to that one.
Fantastic.
Tales from the Trunk is mixed and produced in beautiful Oakland, California. Our theme music is Paper Wings by Ryan Boyd. You can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/trunkcast. All patrons of the show now get a sticker and logo button, along with show outtakes and other content that can't be found anywhere else. You can find the show on Twitter at Trunkcast, and I tweet at HBBisnieks. If you like the show, consider taking a moment to rate and review us on your preferred podcast platform. And remember, don't self-reject.